There are moments in human history when, looking back, everything feels as hazy as early morning mist, the kind that lingers before the earth fully wakes from a long night. It was an age when people did not yet write, did not yet know how to preserve their fear or their hope in any lasting form. And yet, strangely, in that dim and quiet stretch of time, they created one of humanity's most solemn inventions: kingship. The Sumerians, the earliest known inhabitants of the Mesopotamian lowlands, believed that power did not begin in human hands. They said, "It descended from heaven," like a silent thread of order falling onto the earth, choosing a person, a community, a moment. From that invisible light, the first kings stepped into history, though they entered as shadows more than as living figures. We know their names, but we do not know their faces. We know they ruled for very long periods, yet we cannot tell whether those spans are real, or if they reflect an older way of counting time, or memories layered across generations. We know they lived before a great flood, a memory carried by many cultures. But we cannot say whether it was a single event or many stories woven into one. What is certain is this: the Sumerians saw those early kings as the beginning of every organized form of life. With them, history stopped drifting through scattered recollections and started to move with structure, with direction. This is not simply the tale of gods, nor is it just legend. It is the story of people who lived at the boundary between myth and reality. People with unfamiliar names carved into clay tablets, whose traces still lie buried beneath layers of ancient silt. This journey will follow their footsteps, from the earliest rulers recorded in ancient lists, to the cities that rose from mud and marsh, to the struggles over water, to the dynasties that shifted with the rhythm of the rivers. More than 5 millennia have passed, yet their presence still lingers in the soil of Mesopotamia. And so, the search for the kings who once ruled Sumer must begin at the farthest point, the place where history had no name, but the human voice had just begun to speak. When we look at the clay tablets of Sumer, the most bewildering thing is not the sharp, wedge-shaped strokes, nor the impossibly long numbers written beside the early kings. What unsettles us is the sense that we are opening a memory that does not quite belong to the age of human history. The Sumerians did not describe the birth of authority through events. They described it through symbols. And among those symbols, one opening line has made scholars pause for more than a century. When kingship descended from heaven, it was in Eridu. That single sentence opens a chapter that archaeology has barely touched. When the Sumerians spoke of heaven, they were not talking about the sky above, but about a larger order, a silent force shaping the rhythm of land and water. Kingship descended was not meant to recall a mythical moment, but to express the instant a community first agreed that someone should safeguard its harmony. The way the moon guides the tides, Eridu, the first city in Sumerian memory, was not a city in the modern sense. It was more like an anchor point, a place people returned to after the floods, where a quiet temple in the open plain kept the rhythm of scattered communities. In that world, a king was not yet a commander, but a keeper of the land's memory, one who understood when the waters would change course, when the grain should be sown, when a ritual had to be performed to protect the fragile balance between humans and nature. This is why the Sumerians placed their earliest kings before the Great Flood. It was not to magnify them, but to mark a boundary, the line between a world without record and a world where human beings began to need a shared voice. The antediluvian kings carried the weight of a blended timeline. Their lifespans, stretching thousands of years, do not reflect biology. They reflect a memory accumulated across generations, when one leader continued the work of the previous one, and writing did not yet exist to separate where one life ended and another began. Today, archaeology has not found their palaces, their tombs, or their scepters. Yet this absence makes them even more important. They do not appear as individual historical figures, but as the spiritual groundwork of the entire civilization. Without them, without the idea that kingship descended, the later powers of Kish, Uruk, or Lagash would have had no foundation to stand on. And from Eridu, the place where legend plants a first marker, the story begins to lead us into a deeper layer of memory, where the earliest names start to emerge. That journey begins with the figure who stands at the top of the ancient list, Alulim, the king regarded as the origin of humankind's rule. Among all the names the Sumerians left behind, none has sparked more debate than Alulim, the figure placed at the very beginning of their king lists, like the first marker of human authority. His name appears on clay tablets more than 4,000 years old, yet it points to a time far older, a world the Sumerians themselves could only recall through the faint memories of ritual and tradition. They wrote that Alulim ruled in Eridu, the earliest city preserved in Mesopotamian memory. The number beside his name, more than 28,000 years, is clearly not a literal measurement of time. It feels more like a way to express the length of an age without history, a span where generations flowed one into another with no written record to separate them. Alulim, therefore, does not appear as a single individual, but as the threshold between scattered community life and the first awareness of a shared center of order. What makes his presence even more intriguing is the nature of Eridu itself during that age. No palaces, no city walls, no signs of conflict. In such a landscape, the only structure rising through many generations was the temple, rebuilt layer upon layer, like a repeated breath that kept the sacred ground from being erased by floods. If Alulim ever lived as flesh and blood, his power likely did not lie in issuing commands, but in remembering and passing down the crucial rhythms of water, seasons, and ceremony, the elements that held a fragile community together. Some scholars link the name Alulim to the idea of a first initiator, a marker of beginnings. That ambiguity is what makes him compelling. He is both a human figure and a symbol of the shift from small, spontaneous groups to a community that learned to rely on one another, that began to look toward a shared focal point. Beneath the soil of Eridu, archaeology has revealed modest houses, small cultivated plots, and quiet streams crossing the plain, traces of a society learning how to shape order for itself. Perhaps Alulim was the one who kept that early order from dissolving, not through force, but through the presence of someone regarded as the central axis of community life. The Sumerians placing him at the head of their list reflects how they perceived the origin of authority, not beginning with violence, but beginning with stability, something every community needs before it can move forward. Today, we cannot describe Alulim the way we describe historical figures. He is more like a distant glow marking the first hint of a new age, like the faint star at the end of night that signals dawn is near. He represents the moment the Sumerians imagined power being entrusted for the very first time, when someone stepped forward to bridge human life with the order of land and water. And when Alulim's long reign came to an end, whether that ending took place in reality or in the collective memory, kingship did not fade. It passed to the next figure, the way a flame is handed from one hand to another, so it will never go out. The Sumerian list names that successor Alalgar, and with Alalgar, the outlines of kingship begin to sharpen, like a shape emerging on a tablet still soft with clay. The journey continues from here. When Alulim's long reign closed in Sumerian memory, kingship did not dissolve into the mist of an undefined age. It passed on, quiet as a shared breath between generations. His successor, Alalgar, appears in the Sumerian king list like the next note in a newly forming melody of authority, not dazzling, but steady enough to show that kingship was not a sudden spark. It was a stream that could endure. The name Alalgar is often interpreted as the bringer of order, or the one who keeps the waters pure. These meanings echo what the Sumerians valued most: the ability to preserve harmony between people and the waters that shaped all life and Eridu power in his era, carried the tone of careful stewardship rather than sudden change. Alalgar's time still belongs to the age before the flood, a period preserved only as an echo in tradition, yet from his reign onward, the Sumerians seemed determined to give clearer character to each dynasty, not through recorded events, but through the rhythm of community life. The number assigned to his rule, more than 30,000 years, is not history. It is a way of gathering many generations into a single cycle under the name of a king remembered as a symbol of stability. If Alulim opened the idea of kingship, then Alalgar proved that the idea could be carried forward. In the layers of Eridu, archaeologists have found traces suggesting that the community was learning to shape its surroundings. Water channels widened with intent, ground leveled with care, houses built with thicker roofs against the southern winds. These changes are not tied to any one ruler, but they reflect a society reaching a steadier stage beyond its earliest beginnings. What makes Alalgar's reign remarkable is the long stretch of peace. No signs of conflict, no records of disputes, no hint of warfare. In such a young civilization, silence was not a sign of stagnation. It was the foundation needed for a community to learn trust in a shared order, the very condition that would allow the great advances of later ages. For that reason, Alalgar does not stand out as a ruler with grand displays of power. He is more like the second heartbeat in a forming society, not loud, but steady and persistent. We do not find him in stone monuments or towering sculptures, but in the quiet endurance of the people, in their ability to hold on to what they knew and gently expand it with each passing generation. The compilers of the Sumerian king list offered no details about him, likely because they did not know them themselves. But placing his name directly after Alulim was their way of acknowledging that kingship requires not just a strong beginning, but a reliable continuation. And when his era finally closed, the flow of authority shifted again, subtle but distinct, toward the third king, En-mebaragesi, the one who measures divine destiny. With the reign of En-mebaragesi, we move into a phase where kingship becomes more deeply intertwined with the perceived order of the heavens, a new layer in the unfolding journey of Sumer. When Alalgar's long, quiet reign receded like a horizon fading into early morning light, the Sumerians inscribed the next name on their clay tablets, En-mebaragesi. His very name signals a subtle shift. It carries the meaning, one who belongs to divine destiny, or the one who measures the will of heaven. From this point on, authority was no longer tied only to land and water. It began to reach upward, toward the sky, where ancient people believed the deeper order of existence truly began. En-mebaragesi's era still belongs to the world before the Great Flood, a misty realm that archaeology can touch only through speculation and the scattered echoes of tradition. Yet it is precisely that silence that makes his role so striking. This seems to be the stage when human beings first sensed that the sky was not just a guide for farming, but a realm with its own repeating rhythms, as steady as the flow of the rivers. The Sumerian king list states that En-mebaragesi ruled for more than 37,000 years. Of course, that is not a measure of real time. It feels more like a long arc that gathers many lifetimes into a single cycle, long enough for scattered observations of the heavens to form a pattern, long enough for a community to begin believing that the sky itself had a voice. Perhaps this was the time when temple keepers noticed the moon returning to the same place after each cycle, or when they realized that certain stars only appeared during the season of rising waters, while others vanished when the earth cracked in drought. These discoveries, even without instruments, would have created a new kind of authority. The authority of someone who could anticipate changes that every life depended on. If Alulim laid the foundation and Alalgar maintained stability, then En-mebaragesi stood between two worlds, between earth and sky. Tradition calls him the measurer, not because he possessed tools, but because he symbolizes an age that learned to listen to the world in a broader way. Shifting waters, changing winds, the waxing and waning of the moon, all became signs that helped people orient themselves. Eridu, still the center of the pre-flood age, was likely more populated by his time. Its temple, the tallest structure on the plain, remained the place people turned to for certainty. One can imagine a lone figure standing atop the temple before dawn, watching the first light sweep across the floodplain, a moment in which nature itself was believed to send a message. And as people began to look to the sky for answers, they also began to ask questions beyond survival. Why the floods shifted their timing, why the winds stretched on longer than usual, why a constellation dimmed and then brightened again, as if it had never vanished. These questions marked a quiet transformation. Leadership was no longer only about dividing water or guarding land, but about preserving the thread that tied human life to the wider order of the cosmos. Seen through this lens, En-mebaragesi emerges as a guide who led through understanding rather than force. He represents the moment when humans realized they did not merely live in nature. They lived within cycles far larger than themselves, and when his reign came to its distant end, kingship flowed once more to the next name. En-mebaragesi, the figure tradition describes as the one who carries the power of heaven and earth. From here, the idea of authority begins to take on a clearer shape, as though the earliest strokes of writing were pressing into still soft clay. When the reign of En-mebaragesi faded like a thinning cloud before sunrise, the Sumerians named his successor En-mebaragesi, If his predecessor evoked the image of observation and quiet understanding, this new name carried a stronger resonance, the one of heaven and earth's strength, as though kingship had stepped into a firmer, more defined phase in the memory of the people. Though still part of the era before the Great Flood, a time beyond the reach of archaeology, Sumerian tradition describes the age of En-mebaragesi as a point where society had grown more structured. His nearly 25,000 years of rule were never meant as literal chronology, but as a way of expressing the endurance of a long, continuous era passed through many generations. By invoking En-mebaragesi, the Sumerians seemed to suggest that kingship was no longer something new that needed explanation. It had become a natural element of life, like the rising sun or the shifting phases of the moon. Within that steady rhythm, En-mebaragesi was remembered as the figure who held the balance between the two guiding forces of the Sumerian worldview, the mysterious signs of the sky and the ever-changing face of the earth. Descriptions of his age often connect him with small but lasting transformations. An added layer to the temple foundation, thicker walls built to withstand the floods, widened canals that provided water for a growing number of households. These signs point to a community maturing, no longer merely reacting to its environment, but beginning to shape it to meet its needs. If one were to stand atop the Erode temple during the age associated with his name, it is easy to imagine a lone figure watching the wide plain where the two great rivers spread out like sheets of polished glass. Power then did not lie in weapons or commands. It lived in the ability to sense when the land needed rest, when the waters should recede, when a star's appearance signaled a coming season. It was a quiet kind of authority, like groundwater, unseen, but without it, the whole community would lose its balance. It was this ability to harmonize the forces of sky and earth that made En-mebaragesi a cornerstone figure in Sumerian tradition. Kingship required more than beginnings or early interpretations. It needed someone who could bind scattered elements into a system that people could trust. En-mebaragesi embodied that stage, the moment when authority began to take on a recognizable framework, like a structure built from the soft soil of prehistory. And when his era came to an end, kingship moved once more to a successor, Dumuzid, the shepherd, the first king whose identity clearly reflects the working life of ordinary people. From this point on, power began to come closer to the real world, stepping out of the misty realm of legend and into the texture of human experience. When the king list moves past En-mebaragesi and pauses at Dumuzid the shepherd, the atmosphere of the tradition suddenly shifts. The earlier kings feel like silhouettes standing in the mist of prehistory. Dumuzid, by contrast, carries the warmth of the earth, the smell of grass, the dust rising under the feet of herds moving in the sun. For the first time, a king is introduced not through cosmic symbolism, but through a profession rooted deeply in everyday life, a role that could only belong to a real human being. Sumerian tradition preserves two Dumuzids, one, an ancient king ruling in Bad-Tabira, the other, a god appearing in poetry as the beloved of Inanna. Over time, these two images merged, placing Dumuzid at the boundary between mythology and history. Yet in the king list, when his name appears in the line of rulers, a different figure emerges, grounded, practical, and unmistakably human. Bad-Tabira, the place where Dumuzid held power, was an early metallurgical center of Mesopotamia. Excavated layers reveal traces of soft metalwork, large cattle enclosures, and broad grazing fields. In a world where wealth was measured by herds and by the ability to manage them, it wasn't strange for a herdsman to become king. The one who held the largest herds, who understood the land most deeply, and who knew the water best. That was the one who maintained order. Dumuzid's authority, then, did not come from ritual, but from experience, knowing when to change grazing grounds, when the wind would shift, when the herd needed to avoid a suspicious water source. Those skills, simple on the surface, were the survival keys for entire communities living in a harsh river plain. Someone like that, with eyes trained to read tracks on the earth, easily became the pillar everyone depended on. Later poetry would turn Dumuzid into a symbol of seasons and the cycle of life. But the Dumuzid of the king list was a living man walking the open pasture. His 36,000 years of rule are not meant to be literal, but to express the weight and length of influence that collective memory placed upon his role. What's fascinating is that from the time of Dumuzid onward, Sumerians began mentioning professions when speaking of their prehistoric kings. It suggests that power was shifting away from pure supernatural authority and becoming tied to life skills, the skills that ensured a community could endure through each passing season. We can imagine Dumuzid walking along the cracked edges of the plain, shepherd's staff resting on his shoulder, herds stretching behind him like waves. In that world, the one who kept the herd alive was the one who held the breath of life itself. And when Dumuzid's reign came to a close, the king list gives the next name, En-mebaragesi, the true shepherd. By this point, kingship had begun drifting away from the heavens and moving closer to earth, water, and the sources of human survival. Just one more step, and history would reach the place where myth begins to slip away from reality, leaving behind two paths that divide yet run parallel in the memory of Sumer. When the figure of Dumuzid fades into the mist of legend, the king list brings us to the next name, En-mebaragesi. It is an ancient sound, round and gentle like the breath of wind across the plain, meaning the shepherd who guards the herd, a title that seems simple, yet represents the heart of Mesopotamia's early economy and survival. No monument, no long legend, not even a surviving verse speaks about him, but that silence reveals his true place in Sumerian memory, the one who maintained stability, the one standing between unpredictable nature and the community's lifeline. In an age without walls, without armies, without taxes or tribute, herds were the treasure, and the person who kept them safe was the one who preserved order itself. The appearance of Dumuzid and En-mebaragesi side by side shows that authority had shifted from sky watchers to those anchored in practical life, in a land ruled by sudden floods, harsh, dry seasons, and grasslands that changed color with every shift of the wind. The leader had to be someone who could guide the herds, protect them season after season, a skill far more essential than any sacred ritual. We can try to picture Mesopotamia in that time. No vast canal networks yet, only open ground, patches of grass that rose and faded with the rain, and herds moving wherever the water led them. A king in such an age almost certainly did not live in a palace, but out on the plain, feet covered in dust, listening to the low rumble of cattle when the wind changed. Power did not rest in a scepter, but in understanding, reading the grass to find water, reading the clouds to sense the season, listening to the herd to hear danger approaching. The 28,000 years assigned to his reign, like the immense numbers before it, are not a measure of lifespan. They are the compression of memory, a role carried by countless generations and eventually placed under a single name, like a vessel filled by many streams. What matters is that with En-mebaragesi, kingship took on a new shape, the power of caretaking. Not only observing or maintaining, but guarding what was most essential to the community's survival. From this foundation, Sumerian society could later grow into more complex forms of management, economy, distribution, and organized labor. And when his age finally drifted back into the haze of memory, the king list speaks its final name before the Great Flood: En-mebaragesi. If the earlier kings belonged to earth, water, and herds, he belonged to the sky, a figure touched by the sacred, as if Sumerian tradition wanted to draw one last bridge connecting the world of humans to the realm of the gods. From here, the story doesn't simply shift into a new chapter. It rises into a new layer, entering the deepest myth of the Sumerians. As the kings shaped by earth, water, and wandering herds fade into the distant layers of memory, the Sumerian list brings us to the final name before the Great Flood: En-mebaragesi. It is a heavy, deep, steady sound, understood as the man of enduring destiny, or the one upheld by heaven. With him, Sumerian kingship steps away from the physical world and enters a realm where humanity first brushes against something truly mysterious: knowledge. Unlike the kings before him, En-mebaragesi appears in tradition as a figure who didn't die, a man taken up to the heavens to receive understanding, an image so powerful that centuries later it would echo in Hebrew writings under the name Enoch. The traditions are separate, yet they share a quiet thread: the image of a human standing between heaven and earth, between the mortal world and the sacred. But what makes En-mebaragesi truly remarkable is not the mythic glow around him. It is the deeper message the Sumerians preserved. He symbolizes the era when knowledge began to turn into power. This was the dawn when scattered observations of the sky, the shifting phases of the moon, the path of the sun, the arrival of certain stars, slowly formed into a system. En-mebaragesi is remembered as the first to see the order within those movements, recognizing the sky not only as beauty, but as rhythm. Perhaps he was not a single historical person, but the personification of a long process, the moment when humans began to read the heavens as if it were a written text. And in Mesopotamia, where the nights were clear as water and the sky seemed close enough to touch, it is easy to understand why ancient people believed knowledge was not something humans invented, but something given. The king list states that his reign lasted more than 21,000 years. Once again, not a lifespan, but a measure of how deep this memory runs. It represents the age when knowledge rose beyond daily life and became something stored, taught, and tied to authority. From this point on, a leader was not only managing herds or land, he was managing the understanding of the cosmic order. If we imagine En-mebaragesi, he is not walking across pasture land. He stands alone atop a high temple platform in Eridu, watching the sun rise at a precise point on the horizon. He is the one who knows why the moon dims at a particular time, why a certain star appears only when the river changes color, and when the community realized he held the thread that linked heaven to earth, they believed he had been taken up. The appearance of En-mebaragesi is not meant to glorify kingship, but to mark a turning point. The moment when power and knowledge begin to walk together, setting the stage for Sumer's later forms of governance. From here on, the leader is not just the strongest, but the one who understands. Then the king list writes a single short sentence, enough to divide human history in two. And then the great flood came. That sentence is a boundary. On one side is the world of mist, where kings are more symbolic than human. On the other side lies the archaeological world, where cities, wars, fields, and writing begin to leave real traces. From here, kingship enters history. A new chapter opens. The post-flood kings, the first rulers of the human story, with names, with eras, with evidence. When the name En-mebaragesi closes the most mysterious era of the Sumerian king list, the text leaves behind a single, chilling sentence. And then the great flood came. No description, no explanation, no elaboration. Just a clean cut, sharp as a blade, dividing humanity into two halves. On one side lies the world of myth, where people lived for tens of thousands of years, and kingship descended like light from the heavens. On the other side is the world of clay, archaeology, crumbling walls, and writing that begins to take the shape of history. What is strange is that this memory does not belong to Sumer alone. From Anatolia to the Levant, from Iran to the Mediterranean, traditions speak of a great flood at the end of the 4th millennium before the birth of Christ. In Shuruppak, Ur, and Kish, unusually thick layers of silt show that the plain once sank under violent waters. Yet this flood did not necessarily destroy all of Mesopotamia. It felt more like a deep fracture, powerful enough to end an age, significant enough for collective memory to treat it as the boundary between two worlds. After the waters receded, the king list says kingship descended once more, but not in Eridu. This time it appeared in Kish. That shift was strategic. Kish sat at the crossroads of Sumer and Akkad, controlling the entire north-south route, along which goods, migrants, information, and power all flowed. A land emerging from disruption needed a new center to rebuild its rhythm, digging canals, redistributing land, restoring order. Kish became the first flame to relight the plain after the flood withdrew. The Sumerians opened the post-flood age with Jushur, the first king of Kish. No mythic aura surrounds him, no lifespan of 10,000 years, no divine radiance. Everything becomes more human. The lengths of reign begin to shrink, from tens of thousands to a few hundred, then to mere decades, as if history were stepping out of the mist and carrying the breath of real time. Even though Jushur left no archaeological trace, his place in the text reflects something crucial. Power was no longer a cosmic symbol, but a practical necessity for a society rebuilding itself. A land fractured by flood needed someone to restore irrigation, coordinate labor, revive production. In a time of upheaval, a king did not need immortality, only the ability to set life back in motion. From Jushur onward, Sumerian kingship enters a phase that archaeology can follow. Through layers of fresh-fired bricks, expanding towns, and names repeated across multiple sites, kings no longer stand as symbolic figures spanning entire millennia, but as real individuals leading real communities in identifiable places and times. But Kish represented more than recovery. it introduced a new idea: intercity authority. Whoever held Kish controlled trade routes, population movement, and the pulse of the whole region. That is why the title, King of Kish, became a symbol that rose above the borders of any single city-state, a title later Sumerian rulers endlessly sought to claim. After Jushur, the list names Kulasina-Bel, then Nangishlishma, then En-Tara-Ana, kings whose presence feels fully human, no longer shaped by the air of myth. This was the moment when political power began to define itself clearly, stepping slowly but firmly out of prehistoric haze and into the terrain that archaeology can grasp. And from these earliest kings of Kish, power gradually converged around a remarkable figure, one whom Sumerian tradition calls the one who made all things stable. The first character to step out of the list and into a narrative long enough to feel like an epic Etana, the king who flew into the heavens in search of the seed of humanity. A new turn in the story opens here, where history and myth meet once more. The first kings of Kish after the Great Flood appear in the king list, like names stepping softly across still damp earth. Jushur, Kulasina-Bel, Nangishlishma, all brief, quiet, almost hesitant, the early rhythms of a new age trying to regain its breath. But by the fourth or fifth king, the Sumerian tradition changes tone. It speaks the name Etana, and from that moment, history and myth find a place to meet again. The name Etana is understood as the one who makes all things stable, a fitting title for a time when Kish was struggling to rise after the Great Flood. Yet Etana is not just another entry in a list. He is the first post-flood king to step out of the dry lines of the king list and into a full story. The legend of Etana, one of the oldest surviving narratives in the world. In that story, Etana is a king without an heir, and in Sumerian society, lacking a successor was not only a personal worry, it was a threat that could fracture an entire city-state. So Etana sets out to find the plant of birth, the symbol of continuity. Along the way, he rescues an eagle from the jaws of a serpent. Later, when he needs help, the eagle carries him skyward to seek divine approval. The image of Etana riding an eagle is not simply poetic. It symbolizes a shift in power, from strength alone to the ability to seek legitimacy from the divine. This is the moment when Sumerian kingship ceases to be something natural or assumed, becoming instead something that must be sanctioned by cosmic order. What the Sumerians called me, the sacred laws that governed all things. Although archaeology has not uncovered a palace or inscription bearing Etana's name, the growth of Kish during this era is unmistakable. Expanding settlements, more advanced metalworking, and increasingly organized irrigation. All of it aligns with the image of a ruler remembered as the one who established stability. Etana, then, does not live only in legend. He lives in the real transformations that swept through Kish: redistributed land, deeper canals, and a renewed relationship between Kish and Akkad to the north. He represents the passage Sumerian power was moving through, from sacred symbol to the first political model in human history. Etana's significance, however, does not lie in the fact that he ascended to the heavens, but in what followed. Tradition says he did not return, not as a literal death, but as the Sumerian way of saying a king had gone beyond everyday life and become an archetype. He was no longer just a man, but the model of an ideal ruler, one who could organize, one who had divine approval, one entrusted to lead. And from Etana onward, Sumerian history records something for the first time: hereditary succession. His son Bali inherits the kingship. This is a turning point. From here, Sumerian power is no longer shaped by short-lived, post-flood reigns, but begins to take on a continuous structure, paving the way for the era when city-states would struggle for influence on a larger scale. When Etana leaves the page, Kish enters a phase in which every king carries a distinct mark, and with that, the history of Sumer begins to take on its true shape. When Etana's story ends with his ascent into the sky, Sumerian tradition does not allow power to fall into emptiness. For the first time in the Sumerian king list, history presents something more human than divine. Kingship passed from father to son. That successor is Bali, a short, firm name that sounds like a stone striking newly laid brick. Bali's appearance marks a major shift in Sumerian political thought. Before him, although many kings are listed, they do not form a lineage. Power drifted like changing water, never anchored to a single house. But with Bali, the idea of hereditary succession begins to take shape. A small shift on the surface, yet the very foundation of all future state structures. If Etana was the one who established stability, then Bali was the one who had to keep it, a responsibility far from easy. Everything Etana rebuilt after the Great Flood was still fragile. Newly cut canals, freshly redistributed land, and the evolving relationship between Kish and its neighboring communities. Bali stepped into kingship at a moment when everything stood upright, but nothing was firmly rooted. Yet no legend speaks of him. No eagle, no plant of birth, no divine ascent. That silence makes Bali a deeply real king, not part of mythic layers, but part of a society slowly recovering its balance. And that is exactly what gives him importance. Bali represents the moment when power begins turning into an institution, requiring no miracles, only steady order. Archaeological traces around Kish, from the period assigned to Bali, show noteworthy changes. Growing satellite settlements, expanded storage facilities, newly built perimeter walls. To the south, Uruk, after generations of decline, began to revive. This made Bali's era one of tension between two forces, strengthening Kish internally while observing the first sparks of rising competition. Although no object bearing Bali's name has been found, those traces reflect a reign focused on economic management and territorial stability. Precisely what an early kingship needed. Most one detail stands out. After Bali, the next king did not belong to Etana's bloodline. This shows that hereditary succession was only beginning to take root, not yet a consistent standard. Yet Bali inheriting Etana's throne opened a new doorway. Power no longer fell from the heavens, but began to find a place to remain, a lineage to move through. From here, Sumer moved closer to true dynasties, where bloodline, property, and family influence would become pillars of authority. Kish, because of this, rose as the guiding center of the early post-flood world. After Bali, the king list names En-mebaragesi, a figure little described, but one who forms the bridge into a new phase, a time when city-states began to understand their own identities and their roles within an increasingly crowded and competitive land. From this point on, history prepares to step deeper into the light, where archaeology, warfare, fortifications, and writing begin to shape stories that can no longer be mistaken for myth. When Bali fades into the dim light of early history, Kish does not pause. Another name steps onto the clay tablet: En-mebaragesi, And strangely, the closer we get to the period archaeology can grasp, the fainter these transitional kings seem, as if the past itself cast a veil of mist over them to hide the quiet movements of power beneath. En-mebarege's name is not tied to any triumph or legend, yet his presence in the Sumerian king list already tells us something. Kish still stood firm. The machinery of the city continued to run, managing water, dividing land, expanding settlements, even if none of it made noise. History is not always pushed forward by grand figures, but often by those who keep the current from breaking. To see En-mebarege's role, we must widen our view across the whole plain. In the early 3rd millennium before the birth of Christ, the Sumerian city-states began to truly rise. Uruk revived after generations of decline. Lagash emerged with increasingly complex administration, and grew quickly into a commercial hub reaching toward the Persian Gulf. Kish, positioned between south and north, had to strengthen itself if it wished to remain the guiding light tradition once made it. Archaeological layers at Kish reveal expanding canals, enlarging storage facilities, and residential districts stretching along the north-south axis. Though we cannot attribute all of this to En-mebarege alone, we know he ruled at the very moment Kish was shifting from a ceremonial center to an administrative one, from symbol to the reality of governance. After En-mebarege, the kings of Kish ruled slowly and steadily. No great upheavals, but no dramatic breakthroughs either. It was a delicate stability, always threatened by floods, droughts, and the southern rivals growing stronger with each generation. Eventually, that balance could not last. Uruk and were about to enter true expansion, forcing Kish to confront a multi-centered world where no single city-state could claim lasting supremacy. En-mebarege, then, though faint in the record, is a hinge between two eras. The age of Etana and Bali, still tinged with myth, and the coming age of real competition among city-states. He is not a dazzling figure, but he is a necessary one. And from this quiet foundation, Kish prepares to enter a new phase, where power no longer shifts slowly, but is reshaped constantly under the pressure of a plain awakening into history. As En-mebarege fades into the background, Kish does not slip into silence. A new name rises: Zukar. No legends surround him, no victories carved into stone, no clear monuments left behind. But that absence is not the sign of a weak reign. It is the sign that the ground beneath Kish had begun to shake. During Zukar's time, Kish realized that the spiritual authority of the post-flood era was no longer enough to secure its central role. To the south, expanded its maritime trade. Lagash grew wealthy from fertile marshlands. Uruk, though past its peak, still held an undeniable ceremonial prestige. Every city-state was rising, and all were competing for the same thing: water. In this tightening landscape, a king of Kish had to focus on canals, land distribution, and labor coordination. At Tellinghara, traces show expanding waterways, growing storage complexes, and thickening residential zones, signs of a machine tightening itself against southern pressure. Zukar likely did not rule long. He belongs to the sequence of short-lived kings, reflecting a period in which Kish was entering a cycle of rapid political turnover. A hallmark of the early dynastic age stability no longer came from titles, but from the ability to feed the population and manage the seasons. In the late 3rd millennium before the birth of Christ, each flood season could shift the balance. Whoever controlled water controlled the harvest. Whoever controlled the harvest controlled the people. And whoever controlled the people was, in truth, Lugal not myth, but reality. Looking back, Zukar was not the one who changed the fate of Sumer, but he was an important marker, a needle prick in time, showing the moment when power began to move away from the slow rhythms of prehistory and into the sharp jolts of politics. After him, names like Arwium and Abazu appear as faint silhouettes, but their very faintness reveals that Kish was being pulled into a region-wide struggle. Sumer no longer had a single center. It had many, all rising at once. And from this turbulent phase, Kish would approach the threshold of a new era, one in which its kings could no longer simply hold the rhythm, but would have to stand firm against pressures crushing in from both south and north. After Zukar, the king list offers two names as light and fleeting as birds gliding over water: Arwium, then Abazu. No battles, no monuments, no legends. But we should not let that silence deceive us, for sometimes silence is the clearest sign of an age in upheaval. Arwium ruled at a moment when Lagash was rising with an increasingly efficient Ensi administration. Uruk was recovering quickly, and Ur was opening new maritime routes. Kish, caught between them, was being pulled from two directions. Though no surviving text describes his reign, the archaeological layers suggest Kish was reorganizing itself, populations shifting, canals dredged wider, storage facilities expanding. These are not the marks of a dazzling king, but of a state forced to adapt. Before stability could take shape, power shifted again, this time to Abazu, a name so faint it feels buried in silt. Yet this faintness is not insignificance. It signals a king ruling during a period when both nature and politics were changing direction. Rivers shifted, fields changed hands, canals redirected, and where the water moved, power moved with it. Abazu was likely the one who endured the most, and perhaps because of that, he had no time to leave a lasting mark. Though they did not shine, Arwium and Abazu served as foundation stones, rarely noticed, yet without them, the structure would collapse. Thanks to their quiet stewardship, Kish did not break. It retained, however faintly, its identity as a center of kingship, forced to wait patiently for the moment when it could rise again. Meanwhile, to the south, the first great water disputes erupted between Lagash and Umma, conflicts that would define an entire century. And as southern Sumer roiled with tension, Kish had to stand still, watching carefully, maintaining a fragile balance between north and south. The obscurity of Arwium and Abazu, then, is not the sign of weak reigns. It is the mark of an age shaking so violently that even the strongest efforts could only keep the city-state from being swept away. And from that quiet, nearly fractured foundation, a stronger figure would soon emerge: Etana, the man tradition calls the one who restored kingship to Kish. It is no accident that he rises right after years of turmoil like these. After the faint reigns of Arwium and Abazu, the Sumerian king list suddenly brings us back to a name with a very different weight: Etana. He is not a literary hero like Gilgamesh, yet he stands as a landmark, the figure who re-established order after a period of uncertainty in Kish. The Sumerians called him the one who made kingship stable, a simple but sharp affirmation, as if Etana were the hinge that allowed the entire door of history to swing back into place. Etana begins a new cycle of kingship in Kish, and that is no coincidence. After a sequence of short-lived reigns, Kish needed someone strong enough to bind the community together. Someone who could convince people that the world, after the Great Flood, had finally found its rhythm again. This is why the tradition of Etana riding an eagle into the heavens is more than mythology. For the Sumerians, it was a statement of legitimacy. A king must be recognized by the land, but also accepted by the sky. Although archaeology has not uncovered a palace bearing his name, the changes across the Kish region in the late 3rd millennium before the birth of Christ reflect the hand of a structured leader. Canals deepened, land divisions became more defined, and small temples near the city's center were restored. These changes were not grand or dramatic, but steady, like the quiet marks of a rain focused on laying foundations rather than displaying power. What matters most is this. Under Etana, Sumer enters the clear orbit of politics for the first time. From this point on, canals, fields, and labor were no longer just basic necessities, but strategic resources. The city-state that managed them best would rise above the rest. Kish, positioned between north and south, needed a king with a vision that extended beyond its own borders, and Etana's ascent to heaven to ask for a child is not just a religious metaphor. It reflects the deep need of the age. Power required continuity. A city-state without an heir would fall immediately into conflict. By weaving this into myth, the Sumerians turned Etana into a symbol of stability, of a future secured. Seen through both political and archaeological lenses, Etana becomes the first figure in Sumerian history to resemble a true statesman. Someone who understood the land as a system, who could bind scattered communities together, who could arrange resources so no other city-state would eclipse Kish too soon. When tradition says Etana ascended and did not return, it is not describing disappearance, but transformation. He leaves the human world as a symbol, no longer bound to ordinary life. He becomes the first model of divinely blessed kingship, a pattern Kish would invoke many times to reinforce its claim to leadership. Because of Etana, Kish stepped out of fragmentation and into a more confident phase, a period where power was not only about maintaining internal order, but also about expanding influence, negotiating with rivals, and occasionally confronting the southern city-states. And when Etana fades into myth, a new name appears: Kulasina-Bel, the first king of Kish to usher in an era where power no longer relied on the sacred alone, but on the tangible realities of land, water, population, and the accelerating political currents of the plain. A new chapter is about to open, one where kings are no longer shadows in tradition, but figures who leave real traces on the soil of Mesopotamia. After Etana, the emblem of heaven-granted authority, restored stability to Kish, history leads us to a far humbler figure, Kulasina-Bel. If Etana stood between heaven and earth, then Kulasina-Bel stood firmly on the ground, in a world where power no longer leaned on myth, but on the increasingly complex needs of a society growing larger every year. His name, often translated as "All Our Lord," sounds like an echo of its age. Authority no longer concentrated in a single figure, but stretched and pulled in many directions. There is uncertainty within the name itself, as if the era he lived in had not yet fully decided what this new form of power would become. There are no direct archaeological remains tied to Kulasina-Bel's reign, but the layers at Kish show a city struggling to preserve its old order under new pressures. To the south, Ur and Lagash were building organized administrative districts. Uruk, after the age of Gilgamesh, had begun to recover its prestige. Kish, caught between Sumer and Akkad, had to shoulder pressure from both directions. In such conditions, Kulasina-Bel becomes less a sacred ruler and more a manager. The roles of officials, storage overseers, and canal coordinators grew essential. Power, once sanctified by the gods, now had to rely on negotiation, distribution, and administration. Here we see the quiet bridge of the era, the shift from En, the divinely sanctioned leader, to Lugal, whose authority arose from practical, earthly needs across the plain. The rise of powerful southern city-states forced Kish to prove its relevance. The title, King of Kish, once a symbol of supreme authority, began to be challenged. With population growth, expanding farmland, and intensifying competition for water, every city-state aspired to lead. In the time of Kulasina-Bel, Kish saw no brilliant victories, but it did not collapse either. He preserved what the era needed most: continuity. In a time that could easily have fallen into chaos, the simple ability to keep order was an accomplishment in itself. After him, the king list records a sequence of short reigns, a sign that Kish was growing weary, like a flame struggling to steady itself in the wind of a new age. Yet this quiet stretch of history would become the groundwork for something larger. Sumer was about to enter a phase where conflict would no longer be silent, but visible, a period shaped by strong kings, strategic rulers, and city-states that began to see one another less as neighbors and more as rivals. Kulasina-Bel, therefore, was not a great king in the traditional sense, but he stood at the crossroads of tradition and reality. And from this quiet turning point, Sumer was preparing to move into an age of figures with true historical presence, rulers with ambition, vision, and the will to reshape the plain. After Kulasina-Bel, the Sumerian king list drifts across a series of brief names, like faint strokes on packed earth: Nangishlishma, Entara-Ana, Babum. No victories recorded, no monuments remembered, no legends circling their reigns. Yet this silence reveals their age with striking clarity, a time when Kish no longer held unquestioned authority, and the Sumerian plain was beginning to open into multiple competing centers of power. These kings likely ruled only briefly, like small surges of water that cannot redirect a river, but can still reveal that the old flow is weakening archaeological layers at Kish, show that the city continued to farm, maintained its canals and storage houses, but no longer possessed the strength to extend its influence as it once had. This was also the moment when all of Sumer was transforming rapidly. In the southeast, Lagash began producing its earliest administrative tablets, signs of a tightly run governmental system. Ur expanded seaborne trade, opening routes toward Dilmun and Magan. Uruk, though no longer the giant it once was, remained the spiritual center, whose ritual prestige no city-state could ignore. Within this landscape, Kish's authority flickered like a lantern in the wind, not bright enough to lead, but not extinguished either. These faint kings were not weak rulers. They were simply men governing during a time when power no longer belonged to a single center. The Mesopotamian plain was entering its first multipolar age, where every city-state sought to speak with its own voice. At the same time, cuneiform writing spread beyond Uruk, reaching smaller settlements. Records of livestock, barley, and labor became the backbone of urban life. And as administration became the tool of survival, Kish's ancient prestige was no longer enough to sustain its leadership. Yet the faintness of these Kish kings does not signal collapse. It marks a quiet shift, Kish stepping away from the role of guiding center and entering the role of challenged center. A new age required rulers who could prove real power, not rely on the fading glow of the past. Meanwhile, in the south, the first recorded water conflicts in human history ignited between Lagash and Umma, struggles inscribed in clay. Even without fighting in these wars, Kish felt their impact deeply. As the southern city-states grew stronger, Kish had to redefine its place, to adapt or be pushed aside. And yet, amid all this shaking, Kish did not disappear. Instead, this dim, quiet period became the soil in which it gathered strength for a new cycle. Kish stepped back, but it did not leave the stage. In this fragile pause, history shifted its wind. From beneath the settling earth, a small but firm name appears: Puanam, the signal that Kish was preparing to reclaim its position in a world that would no longer grant anyone an easy path. Ahead lies an age in which the kings of Kish could no longer merely hold the rhythm, but had to enter the full contest of a multi-centered Sumer, full of movement, collisions, and transformations that would no longer allow any city-state to stand still. As Sumer moved deeper into the early dynastic age, the light of power no longer revolved around a single center. The kings of Lagash began inscribing their campaigns on stone. Ur grew ever stronger through maritime trade. Uruk maintained its spiritual authority. In this shifting landscape, Kish, once the symbol of the earliest kingship, now faced a daunting challenge: how not to become a shadow of its own past. This is the moment when Puanam appears. The Sumerian king list gives him a modest place. No myths attached, no victories claimed. Yet that very simplicity reveals much about the period he ruled. A king without legend is usually one who takes the throne at a time when a city does not need expansion, but needs someone steady enough to hold what remains. In Kish, during Puanam's time, archaeology does not show the explosive construction seen in Uruk or the administrative sophistication of Lagash. Instead, we see subtle signs of reorganization: canals redirected slightly, residential zones adding more storage space for grain, and small temples repaired rather than rebuilt. These traces belong to a city trying to stabilize itself, maintaining a steady breath in an era where competition came not only from beyond its walls, but from internal social shifts as well. Puanam may have ruled when Kish held only part of the symbolic weight of the title, King of Kish. Other city-states, especially Ur and Lagash, had ambitions to claim that title as proof of their rising dominance. The story of power in Sumer at this time resembled a newly opened board. Every new king testing what move he could make, and every step recorded not in myth, but in administrative tablets spreading across the plain. One notable point: the weakening of Kish did not mean collapse. Though no longer able to command vast regions as it once did, Kish maintained its position as an upper river hub, connecting Akkadian communities to the north with the Sumerian cities to the south. Puanam, through the eyes of his own age, was likely a stabilizer, someone who kept Kish from slipping out of the main current, while powerful southern rivals grew stronger in both economy and governance. During Puanam's period, early evidence of social stratification also became more pronounced. Tablets from neighboring cities show specialized labor groups: land clearers, scribes, canal overseers. No longer seasonal workers, but permanent parts of urban administration. Though Kish left few records from this era, similar developments almost certainly took place there. No city-state could survive without participating in the region's broader transformation. Puanam may have recognized a new truth. Kingship could no longer depend on myth, as in Etana's time, nor on ancient prestige alone. The power of a city-state now rested on its ability to control water, maintain production, and negotiate with rivals who possessed increasingly complex administrative tools. Yet history rarely grants quiet kings much time. Not long after Puanam, Kish entered another period of upheaval. The rulers who followed him were quickly drawn into the intensifying competition among southern city-states, especially Lagash and Umma, whose disputes over water channels were beginning to shift from conflict to open warfare. Puanam was, in a way, the quiet breath before the rising wind, the one who helped Kish remain balanced at a moment when the plain was tightening around it. But soon after him, the age would no longer be calm. Kish would face greater tests, ones demanding not just stability, but strength and strategy. And from here, history leads us toward kings with clearer footprints, rulers who would face, directly and unmistakably, the first intercity conflicts ever recorded in writing. After Puanam, Kish entered a new historical landscape, one where its voice no longer carried as far as before, yet its symbolic weight still made every city-state wary. This was the age when the Lagash-Umma conflict began shaking the entire Sumerian plain. And though Kish stood far from the front lines, every tremor from the south rippled northward like an underground tide impossible to ignore. The Sumerian king list continues with a sequence of short-lived rulers, flickers of flame in a strong wind, appearing and vanishing without buildings, texts, or legends to anchor them. Yet this quietness reveals the truth of the era. Sumerian power was fragmenting faster than ever before. While Kish slipped into a chain of faint dynasties, the south blazed with rulers whose presence is unmistakable in written history. Eannatum, En-mebaragesi, Ush, Lugalzagesi, leaders who, for the first time, left behind records of war, borders, treaties, and accusations carved in stone. The conflict over the Guadena region between Lagash and Umma was not simply a territorial dispute. It marked the birth of military history in written form. Kish, though not a participant on the battlefield, was drawn into this storm in a different way. As Lagash expanded, Umma resisted, and southern kings asserted their dominance. The title, King of Kish, became a mirror in which they measured their ambitions. It symbolized supreme authority over the plain. Anyone who wished to stand at the top of Sumer wanted that title, or wanted to deny Kish's right to hold it. This forced the kings of Kish after Puanam to redefine themselves in a world that no longer followed the model of one center with many satellites, but instead functioned as a mesh of several equally powerful centers. And as that mesh grew denser, strength no longer lay in symbols, but in land, water, labor, and organizational skill. Even so, Kish held a few crucial advantages. At the crossroads between northern Akkad and the southern Sumerian cities, Kish remained a commercial gateway, a place where goods, people, and ideas passed back and forth. But this position carried risks. When southern wars disrupted trade, Kish suffered. When northern communities grew stronger, Kish's influence shrank. The kings of this era were like boatmen standing between two opposing currents, forced to balance themselves every day. during this period, the nature of kingship itself began to change. Once war was recorded in cuneiform, once borders were carved into stone, once treaties were sealed with cylinder stamps, a king could no longer be a figure of ritual alone. He had to be negotiator, and commander. And the Lagash-Umma conflict opened the door to this new requirement, transforming Sumerian kingship into a more practical, less purely sacred institution. Through all this turbulence, Kish did not disappear. Instead, it shifted into a new role. A once powerful center, now challenged from both north and south, yet still possessing a distinct identity. Its kings were no longer unshakable, but they remained significant enough to make other city-states think twice before claiming supremacy. And then, precisely as Sumer fractured more deeply than ever, a quiet movement from the north began shaping the entire plain. A semi-nomadic people, speakers of a language not Sumerian, stepped out from obscurity and began placing their footprints in the heart of Mesopotamia. These were the Akkadians. They were not merely migrating. They were observing, learning, and preparing to enter the grand stage. While the Sumerian city-states exhausted themselves in conflict, one figure from the north would soon rise, carrying an ambition never seen before, a will unmatched, and a vision that rejected the old model of the city-state. A man who would shake the entire Mesopotamian world. A name that would echo for more than 4,000 years Sargon. While the echoes of the Lagash-Umma conflict still trembled across stone inscriptions, and while the Sumerian city-states continued to battle over narrow channels of water, a different movement, slower, deeper, began to spread down from the north. In the land between Kish and the Akkadian highlands, communities speaking a Semitic tongue were extending their influence, not through sweeping wars, but through trade, migration, and small yet enduring networks. The final kings of Kish in this era, names that slide quickly across the king list, like Mashta, Tizkar, Ilku, were no longer rulers of a dominant center. They were more like dim lanterns glowing against the rising light of a new dawn. They continued to reign, to uphold rituals, to bear the sacred title, King of Kish. But the world around them had shifted. Sumer was no longer a closed plain governed by the rhythm of flood and drought. It was now open, stirred by flows of people, goods, and ideas crossing beyond familiar borders. It was in this moment of transition that a name appeared, small at first, faint, the way all great movements begin. He was a cupbearer in a temple, then the leader of a small band of soldiers, and eventually the heart that unified Akkad. A man not born from the ancient bloodlines of Sumer, yet with ambition so vast that the old world could not contain its Sargon. When Sargon of Akkad began expanding his influence, the last kings of Kish faced a harsh truth. The first unification in the history of Mesopotamia would not come from a Sumerian ruler, but from an outsider. This was not because the Sumerian kings were weak, but because history had led them to a dead end. Each Sumerian city-state was too strong to be absorbed, yet too weak to dominate the others. Only a force from beyond could break the fragile equilibrium. The final kings of Kish, though still holding the sacred title, the one appointed by the heavens, no longer guided the plain. They became witnesses, standing at the riverbank as an entire era drew to a close. The same rivers that once sustained them now became the routes through which Akkadian armies marched south, slowly binding the land into a greater union. Yet the end of the Sumerian kings was never truly an end. For Sumer itself, with its writing, its administrative systems, its temples, its mastery of water and seasons, provided the very structure upon which Sargon built his empire. Without that foundation, no empire could have stood. And when Sargon unified the land, when Akkad rose as the first true empire of humanity, the Sumerian kings, though stepping back, did not vanish. They transformed. They became regional governors, temple overseers, guardians of tradition. They preserved the voice of Sumer in a world already changing color. Looking back across the journey from the legendary Alulim to the last kings before Sargon, one truth becomes clear. Sumer was never the story of rulers standing alone. It was the story of a civilization evolving through each generation, each hand, each layer of river clay. Kings with great deeds, kings remembered by a single line. All of them were fragments of a long epic, each verse flowing into the next without ever repeating itself. And as we close this journey, a quiet stillness settles, like water returning to calm after a boat has passed. Sumer's history, though it pauses at the threshold of Akkad, does not disappear. It continues to flow, to influence, to reappear in every civilization that followed. In the end, when we look at the kings who once ruled Sumer, we see more than power. We see endurance, the endurance of people who learned to live with water, with earth, with time. People who wrote the first chapter of human history in clay, in labor, and in a memory carried across thousands of years. And perhaps that is the truest kingship of all, the kingship of memory.